Hey gang, and welcome to another Dueling Rabbits Productions video about drawlooms and matters arising. Today we're going to go back to basics and discuss good practice for rigging the lower tie-ups on a Glimakra muirhead drawloom with a vertical countermarch and 2 sets of lambs. There are lots of ways to accomplish this deceptively simple feat, but this is the method I've personally found to be the most effective for balancing my setups and making my weaving enjoyable and stress-free. We'll begin by reviewing how a vertical countermarch works to raise and lower the shafts of our choosing before we delve into the whys and wherefores. We'll finish, as we so often do, with a quick demo that puts it all together. Let's start with the countermarch itself, which we are viewing from the back of the loom. The ground shafts hang from the jacks, or coopers, which on a drawloom, funnily enough, are mounted upside down. Each jack is connected to one ground shaft and one lower lamb, ranked from the front of the loom towards the back. The left-hand cord for each shaft runs from the lower end of its associated jack over this set of pulleys and down to its connection on the upper shaft bar. The right-hand cord runs from the upper end of the jack over this set of pulleys and down to its connection at the other end of the same upper shaft bar. For each jack, a third cord runs from the very bottom over a pulley on the outside of the loom and down the frame. This cord is connected to the appropriate long lower lamb. The connection from treadle to shaft is made indirectly via the lower lamb, so that when I press this treadle, the shaft in question goes up. Have you ever really thought about what's going on every time you press a treadle? It's cool. As I press my treadle, the lower lamb it's connected to is pulled down, causing ingenious things to happen with my upper tie-ups. As the cord to my lamb, outside the loom on the right, is pulled down, it tugs on the lower end of the jack. This kicks out the bottom of the jack, the same end that's connected to the sinking lamb. This action pulls with it the cord going to the left-hand side of the upper shaft bar, causing the shaft to go up. At the same time, the other end of the shaft bar, attached to the top of the jack and traveling in the opposite direction, also goes up. In this way, connections between a lower lamb and a treadle cause the associated ground shafts to rise when the treadle is pressed. Remember, lower lambs lift. But since this is a countermarch loom, there's also a lot of sinking happening while all this elevating is going on. This is because each ground shaft has an additional connection. Its lower shaft bar is connected directly to an upper lamb with a short cord like this one. This is a more direct connection. Where a treadle is connected to an upper lamb, pressing the treadle causes the lamb to be pulled down, bringing its ground shaft with it. In this case, my treadle is connected to 3 upper lambs, so 3 of the ground shafts are sinking. It's a complex dance, with connections between shafts and treadles mediated by the upper and lower lambs, and with many lambs, although on a drawloom not all the lambs, in motion every time a treadle is pressed. The complex interplay of rising and falling parts can become a bit of a tangle for the unwary. How do we balance all the moving pieces so they don't get snarled up? By embracing a few basic imperatives about our setup. First and foremost, we must configure our lambs, that is, tie them to the ground shafts and treadles, in ways that ensure they do not collide with one another. We must also be careful that their movement neither constrains the shafts nor overstretches the warp. A big part of accomplishing this task lies in how we tie up the treadles. Since most lambs are on pivots, the treadle here is closest to the pivot point on my loom, it makes sense to keep treadles close together and towards the center of the loom. This helps reduce the impact of the pivot on each treadle's range of motion. Finally, treadles should be tied up as low as possible, for at least 2 reasons I can think of. First, the weight of the treadle is balanced against the weight of the rest of the setup, and this is most effective where the treadle at rest is horizontal to the floor, or angled slightly downwards from the rear pivot. I believe vector forces and trigonometry are involved. Second, I like the treadle to touch the floor when the lambs are in their most extreme position. The floor acts as a stopper so that I am not tempted to press too hard and send the system into overdrive. Finally, we must not forget the most important goal: a beautiful, weavable shed with a solid floor and a smooth ceiling, just deep enough that we can throw our favorite shuttle. Does this sound like a lot? Achieving all these goals is way easier than you might think. Let's do it. Before we get started, let's survey the situation. The ground shafts are hung at their operating height. The warp is tied on at the front of the loom and tensioned. For the purposes of this video, I've hidden the pattern leashes off camera so you can see what's going on. Normally, I do the next steps before I deploy the leashes onto their pattern shafts at the center of the loom. Make sure the locking pin is in. Next, I survey my 2 sets of lambs and my treadles. For this setup, with its 4 ground shafts, I require 4 upper lambs and 4 lower lambs only. I always mount exactly the number of lambs I need for any given setup. I have 10 treadles on my loom at all times, but only tie up the ones I need. I like to center my treadles and use ones further away from the pivot point if possible, since this is a narrow loom. I need 5 treadles for this structure, which I will center around this point. I need these 2 for plain weave. I'll leave this one untied as a spacer and tie up these 3 for my structure. We'll tie up the upper lambs first. I'm sitting inside the extension now, facing the front of the loom. Using 2-legged pegs, I'm going to connect each ground shaft to its upper lamb through the lamb's central hole. On the lower lambs, we're going to leave these holes empty. The lower bars of the ground shafts are connected to the lambs, so the tips of the lambs point slightly upwards. This is important for guarding against collisions later on. The lambs should all be the same height as one another. I'm careful to ensure I'm connecting the lambs in order, starting at the front and working towards the back of the loom. When I'm done, you can compare the placement of the lambs to the horizontal lower shaft bars and the knee beam at the front of the loom. I would estimate the lambs are hanging, a little less than 10 degrees above horizontal. Lower lambs next. These should be connected to their cords so that they are horizontal to the floor. Again, they should all be the same height. Because the cords are so long and the pulleys are so far above my head while I'm sitting inside the loom, I'm very careful to be sure the correct jack is being connected to the lamb I'm working on. When both sets of lambs are tied up, it's time to drop the cords for the treadles. I use a variant of the Vavstuga system where cords with black beads on the end are used for sinking tie-ups to the upper lambs and white beads are used for the rising tie-ups on the lower lambs. Each Texsolve cord is threaded first through a bead and then through itself to secure the end. My black beaded cords are about 22 inches long, my white beaded cords are 17 inches long, a bit longer than the cords I reserve for my single harness setups. I'm sitting inside the loom again, facing forward. Here's my tie-up diagram for the Bergman weave I did in an earlier video. Each row represents a ground shaft, and each column represents a treadle. Circles represent connections to the lower lambs with a white beaded cord, and X's represent connections to the upper lambs with black beaded cords. Blank squares indicate where there are no connections at all. I'm holding my diagram upside down so it corresponds to my position in the loom. The front of the loom is here, and the back of the loom is here. I personally like to drop my cords treadle by treadle, from left to right. I can see from my diagram that, for the leftmost treadle from my current perspective, 3 ground shafts at the front of the loom will need sinking connections, and the shaft at the rear will need a rising connection. These are the columns of holes that correspond to the treadle in question on the upper and lower lambs. Upper lambs first. I take up a black beaded cord and thread it through the upper lamb to the frontmost ground shaft. drop its tail in front of its corresponding lower lamb. I take up another cord and do the same thing again, although this goes through the appropriate hole in the second lamb from the front, which is attached to the second ground shaft from the front. Its cord drops in front of the second lower lamb. So far, so good. The third black beaded cord goes into the third lamb from the front, which is connected to the third ground shaft from the front. Its cord goes in front of the third lower lamb. Finally, the one rising tie-up for this treadle, a white beaded cord, goes into the same column of holes, but on the lower lamb. Its tail drops directly to the treadle below. These are the 4 connections to the first treadle complete. Second treadle now. I see that my connections are reversed. For my next treadle, the 3 ground shafts at the front must all have rising connections, while the one at the back has a sinking connection. Piece of cake. I drop the white beaded cords in the next column of holes in my lower lambs, starting at the front of the loom. 1, 2, 3. My one black beaded cord goes through the upper lamb for the rearmost ground shaft. I pass its cord in front of the rearmost lower lamb. I do find that it's important to be consistent about where I drop the cords from the upper lambs. If they are on different sides of the lower lambs, collisions and twisting can occur. The next treadle on my diagram is the first for my foundation structure, and I want to leave an untied treadle before it. I identify the column of holes in each lamb that I want to skip and proceed to the next. I continue dropping my cords as dictated by my tie-up diagram. Now, there are many other methods for doing this, including well-regarded systems involving single cords through both sets of lambs and cords mounted permanently in all possible positions. But I find this minimalist approach helps me avoid confusion and makes individual adjustments later on easy to identify. It's very much a matter of personal preference, and your mileage may vary. Anyway, when all is said and done, it looks like this. I find it a simple matter to check my cords against the tie-up diagram and feel pretty confident that I've got it right. The next step is to tie up the treadles. I don't usually do this until my pattern shafts have been deployed, but I'm keeping them off screen for now so I have room for the camera. Here's my gear for this step: a pile of arrow pegs and a crochet hook in the eventuality that some cords will need a bit of coaxing through the holes in the treadles. I like to kneel in front of the loom to tie up my treadles, so that's where I'm headed now. We're going live. Okay, so here I am at the front of the loom. Hello! And I'm going to tie up this treadle first. This is the one closest to the pivot point on the right-hand side as I sit to weave. I don't know why, but I like to work from right to left. Things seem to not get in the way that way. So the first thing I want to do is separate the 4 cords that are going to be attached to this treadle. I just sort of hang them on the right-hand side. And I want to have my treadle at about 5.5 inches off the ground. Usually I eyeball it at the bottom of the footrest. Today I'm going to be really diligent, so I'm going to put it about there. I'm going to take my rearmost cord, because that's the one that's going to be the shortest, and I'm going to stick it through there. I'm going to pinch it so that my treadle is at the right height, and I can feel where the cord is meeting the treadle. I'm going to take my pin, stick it through the nearest hole in the Texsolve, and let it go. And now my treadle is pretty much at the right height where I want it to be. Any connections closer to the front will be either the same length as this one, or as I get closer and closer to the front of the loom, I may make them a little longer. But I don't have that many cords for this, so I'm probably not going to bother. At this point, I'm going to put my remaining 3 cords in the holes where they naturally fall, which, as you can see, with this setup on this loom, is quite far to the back of the treadle, but that's okay. I don't mind that at all. I'm going to grasp my next pin, pinch the second cord from the back, right where I can feel it meet the bottom of the treadle, and put my pin in the hole of the Texsolve.
do the next one, same thing. I'm pulling it, I'm making sure it's fairly taut, it's not ridiculously tight, and pinching the textile where my thumb meets the bottom of the treadle, and I'm putting my pin in the nearest hole. And then I do the one at the very front, and this one probably I'm going to give it an extra hole. So I'm going to give myself a little bit of slack, and in goes my pin. And that's pretty much all there is to it. I'm going to do the rest of them, and then we'll try it out. So, next treadle. Here we go. I take my cords, I drop them to the right as I look at the back of the loom. I want my treadles to be pretty much the same height, so I'm just going to hold it there. I'm going to take the rearmost cord, drop it where it wants to be, put my treadle where I think it wants to be, pinch it with my finger, and stick the pin in. And now I'm going to do the rest of them. I'm going to drop the rest of my cords. Like so. That's Jensen, by the way. I think he wants feeding. And do the same pinchy fingery thing with all the others. And I'm going to do that until all of my treadles are tied up.
From the front of the loom, you can see the treadles are all more or less the same height, close together, and angled slightly downwards from their pivot points. Their bottoms are a little less than 6 inches from the floor. From inside the loom, we can clearly see our tie-up to the lambs. The upper lambs are pointing slightly upwards, and the lower lambs are parallel to the floor. The cords to the treadles travel downwards in straight lines with no weird angles front to back, or forcing of the lambs to places they don't want to go. Now, it's time to remove the locking pin and test the system. Here are some key adjustments to remember. If a shaft is not being pulled down far enough, shorten the cord between the treadle and its upper lamb. If a shaft is not being pulled up far enough, shorten the cord between the treadle and its lower lamb. In both cases, shortening the cord increases the range of motion in the treadle. Shortening a cord is easy to do. If the fix is being made below the treadle, just move the arrow peg up a hole or two in the TechSolve. Experience will guide you there. I rarely move the pegs more than 3 holes at a time, and often just 1 or 2 before testing the setup again. The change can also be made above the lamb. Just insert a new arrow peg below the bead. This can be easier than climbing under the loom all over again. If a shaft is being pulled down too far, lengthen the cord to the upper lamb. If it is being pulled up too far, an unusual occurrence, frankly, lengthen the cord to the lower lamb. This adjustment must be made below the treadle by moving the appropriate arrow peg down a few holes in the TechSolve cord. For exhaustive details about troubleshooting drawloom tie-ups, please see my earlier video, Perfecting the Drawloom Shed. I hope this basic how-to has demystified the tie-ups for the vertical countermarch a little bit and given you some ideas about how to approach your next setup. In my next video, we're going to simplify things even more by dispensing with a whole set of lambs and tying up our countermarch with only one. I hope you'll join me then. And for now, as always, thank you so much for watching.